It moves without making a sound that anyone in Washington would recognize as a threat. 2 kilometers of steel, stretching across a frozen wilderness like a mechanical spine pressed into the earth. No urgency in its rhythm, no announcement of its departure, no beacon broadcasting its position to the surveillance systems that were specifically designed and expensively maintained to stop exactly this kind of thing from happening. No ocean, no tanker, no Western satellite locking onto a vessel identification number and flagging it for review. No maritime insurance broker in a London office pausing over a suspicious voyage record. No compliance officer at a European bank declining a wire transfer linked to a blacklisted cargo. Nothing. Just steel wheels grinding against steel rails. Just the low, steady, indifferent, mechanical heartbeat of a train crossing one of the most politically charged stretches of territory on the surface of the planet. And inside those tank cars, Iranian crude oil, sanctioned, blacklisted, declared politically radioactive by the most powerful economic enforcement apparatus in human history, moving steadily, deliberately, and by every measure Washington could bring to bear, illegally, heading directly for Chinese refineries. This was not a desperate smuggling operation conducted by men in small boats hoping to slip past a Coast Guard patrol in the darkness. This was not a lone tanker sailing without a transponder, running dark through open water and praying no satellite was pointed in its direction. This was something categorically different. A coordinated, engineered, multi-nation logistical architecture that had taken years to design, fund, and construct. A system that had quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary strategic patience rendered one of America's most powerful foreign policy instruments effectively obsolete. January 2024, Central Asia. The winter there is not the kind of cold that people in temperate climates can really imagine. It is absolute. It is structural. Temperatures in parts of Kazakhstan plunge to minus 30 degrees Celsius and beyond. The sky sits low and colorless over a landscape of frozen steppe that stretches to every horizon, broken only by the occasional railway junction and the skeletal silhouettes of Soviet-era infrastructure left standing in the emptiness. In that environment, remote, desolate, operating almost entirely beyond the attention of the Western press, a train so long that walking its full length would take the better part of 20 minutes crossed an international border. Onboard cargo that neither Beijing nor Tehran had any interest in publicizing. No press conferences had been arranged, no official statements had been issued, no diplomatic cables had been sent in advance that might alert the intelligence networks that had spent years and billions of dollars trying to prevent precisely this kind of transaction. But intelligence agencies eventually learn what they need to know, and when the first confirmed reports reached the relevant desks in Washington, in Brussels, in London, and in Tel Aviv, the reaction was not confusion. It was not skepticism about the reliability of the information. It was alarm. Because in that single rail journey across the Central Asian desert, China and Iran had accomplished something that years of shadow shipping, financial engineering, corporate obfuscation, and diplomatic maneuvering had never fully delivered. They had moved Iranian oil, sanctioned, blacklisted, politically radioactive Iranian oil, from Iranian oil fields all the way to Chinese refineries, without ever touching the ocean. Without ever entering the maritime system that the United States had spent the better part of 5 decades learning to monitor, to manipulate, and to control. They had found the gap in America's armor, and they had walked an entire train through it. This is not simply the story of a trade route. This is the story of how the architecture of American global power, constructed with extraordinary care and patience over 8 decades, is developing cracks that no amount of policy adjustment may be able to fully seal, and it raises a question that strategists and economists are only now beginning to genuinely grapple with. What happens to the international order when the sanctions stop working? Welcome to Frontline Reports. I'm Nico. Let's find out. To truly understand the magnitude of what that January train represented, you first need to understand what it was designed to defeat. Because the sanctions system built around Iranian oil was not improvised. It was not fragile. It was not a blunt instrument clumsily applied by officials who didn't understand the terrain they were operating in. By virtually any objective measure, it was one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive instruments of economic coercion ever constructed by any government in the modern era. Start with the fundamental facts of how oil moves around the world. Every single day, the global economy consumes approximately 100 million barrels of crude oil. That number is so large it resists intuitive comprehension. To put it in physical terms, roughly 42 billion liters, enough to fill approximately 17,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Every 24 hours, without interruption, 7 days a week, every week of every year. The overwhelming majority of that oil travels by sea. It moves aboard the largest vehicles that human civilization has ever built. Supertankers, technically designated as Very Large Crude Carriers, or VLCCs. A single VLCC measures more than 300 meters from bow to stern, longer than 3 standard football pitches placed end to end. It can carry up to 2 million barrels of crude oil in a single voyage, crossing entire ocean basins in the process. These vessels are slow, enormous, and utterly indispensable to the functioning of the modern world. Stop the tankers, and the consequences are immediate and catastrophic. Factories go dark. Airlines are grounded. Supply chains seize. Economies that have been running on the assumption of continuous energy supply begin to fail within days. But here is the crucial characteristic that makes the maritime oil system simultaneously so central to the global economy and so susceptible to external control. These ships are visible. Profoundly, unavoidably, structurally visible. A supertanker cannot disappear. Every vessel of meaningful size emits an automatic identification system signal, AIS, that is tracked continuously by satellites, by Coast Guard agencies, by maritime insurance firms, and by an entire sophisticated commercial industry of vessel intelligence companies that have built extensive databases around the continuous monitoring of shipping movements. Every major port in the world logs arrivals and departures. Every legitimate voyage requires insurance coverage. Insurance that is overwhelmingly provided by Lloyd's of London and a small number of major European syndicates. And insurance requires disclosure, complete, documented, verifiable disclosure. Beyond the visibility, there is financial dependency. Moving oil internationally requires banking infrastructure, letters of credit, wire transfers, currency exchanges, and the overwhelming majority of those financial transactions flow, at some point in their journey, through systems directly or indirectly subject to American regulatory authority. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is the messaging backbone of the entire global banking system. Access to SWIFT and access to the US dollar clearing system that sits behind it is something that no serious international business can afford to lose. It would be like losing the ability to speak the language that global commerce is conducted in. Washington understood all of this perfectly, and it built its sanctions architecture around that understanding with remarkable precision. When the United States decides to economically isolate a nation, it does not need to deploy a naval battle group to every major shipping lane, though it maintains the capability to do exactly that. Instead, it follows the oil. It identifies the tankers. It blacklists the shipping companies. It pressures maritime insurers to withdraw coverage. It freezes the financial accounts. It leans on port operators. And suddenly, a country sitting atop decades of proven oil reserves finds itself unable to sell a meaningful barrel to the global market. Not legally, not efficiently, and not without paying a commercial price so severe that the overwhelming majority of serious international buyers simply walk away. For Iran, this machinery became a daily lived reality in May 2018, when President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The nuclear agreement that had been negotiated over years of painstaking diplomacy and reimposed the full weight of American economic sanctions on Tehran. The consequences were immediate and severe. Iranian oil exports, which had climbed to approximately 2.5 million barrels per day during the period following the original nuclear agreement, collapsed with startling speed. By 2020, they had fallen to roughly 400,000 barrels daily, a reduction of more than 80%. Insurance companies stopped covering Iranian tankers. European banks severed every relationship touching Iranian business. Major international ports turned away vessels even suspected of carrying Iranian cargo, and a sophisticated network of satellite operators, maritime intelligence firms, and financial compliance professionals made the traditional methods of evasion progressively more expensive, more risky, and more difficult to sustain. Iran adapted, because it had no choice but to adapt. What analysts came to call the Dark Fleet emerged over the following years. A growing collection of aging, frequently unregistered, often uninsured vessels willing to sail with their tracking transponders disabled, their names changed, their flags switched between registries, and their cargo manifests systematically falsified. These ghost ships would conduct what the industry terms ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, pulling alongside other vessels in the middle of open ocean to pump their cargo across, creating additional layers of obscuration around where the oil had actually originated. Iranian crude would be relabeled as Malaysian, Omani, or Emirati before continuing toward its final destination. It worked, partially, but it was expensive, operationally dangerous, logistically nightmarish, and never fully reliable. Every Dark Fleet voyage was a carefully calculated risk. Every intermediary in the chain added cost and complexity. Every falsified shipping manifest represented a potential legal exposure. And satellite imagery technology kept improving, steadily, year by year, making previously invisible movements visible. Iran could evade, but it could not escape, not through the maritime system. Not until Beijing decided it was time to think in an entirely different dimension. China and Iran are not natural partners in any meaningful ideological or civilizational sense. There is no shared cultural heritage connecting Beijing and Tehran, no common religion, no deep historical alliance forged over centuries, no sentimental bond that ties their populations together in any organic way. What connects the two governments is something considerably more pragmatic, considerably more durable in the context of the contemporary world, and, in terms of its implications for the global order, considerably more consequential. Each country has something the other desperately needs. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. Its economy, the second largest on Earth by most measures, runs fundamentally on energy. More than 11 million barrels of crude arrive in Chinese ports every single day. That fuel powers the factories that manufacture the electronics, clothing, machinery, and industrial goods that supply global markets. It powers an expanding middle class whose consumption patterns are steadily reshaping global trade flows. It powers the infrastructure programs, dams, railways, highways, urban construction, that are physically transforming China's landscape at a pace and scale without historical precedent. China's appetite for oil is not a cyclical fluctuation. It is a structural, permanent feature of the Chinese economic model, and it is not going away in any time frame that current policy planning needs to concern itself with. Iran, meanwhile, sits atop the fourth largest proven oil reserves on the planet. An estimated 208 billion barrels of crude beneath Iranian soil. Enormous, established, proven wealth. Wealth that could, if it consistently reached willing buyers at something approaching market prices, fundamentally transform Iran's economic position and its government's capacity to operate. The problem was that Washington had placed itself directly between the seller and the buyer. And for years, China managed that reality through elaborate and expensive workarounds. Chinese independent refineries, known in industry circles as teapot refineries, a reference to their relatively modest scale compared to the giant state-owned operations, became the primary channel. These facilities, clustered largely in China's Shandong province, had built entire business models around processing deeply discounted crude from politically complicated sources. Individually, they were too small to attract the level of scrutiny that purchases by major state-owned refiners might generate. Collectively, however, they represented enormous processing capacity. Iranian oil would arrive at these teapot refineries after passing through multiple layers of intermediaries, shell companies registered in third countries chosen specifically for their opacity, brokers operating in deliberately obscure jurisdictions, transactions structured at every step to conceal origin and ownership. Both governments maintained what diplomatic professionals call plausible deniability, the ability to assert with a straight face that they had no reliable knowledge of where the oil had originated. But plausible deniability has structural limits. Maritime tracking technology was improving continuously. American intelligence capabilities around tanker monitoring were advancing. The financial compliance industry, the banks, the insurers, the shipping companies, was becoming steadily more sophisticated in its ability to identify Iranian origin crude even after it had been relabeled and repackaged. Every voyage of the Dark Fleet was becoming more visible. Every intermediary was becoming a more serious liability. Every transaction was leaving traces that had not existed before. So China and Iran began asking a fundamentally different strategic question. Not, how do we hide this more effectively within the existing maritime system? But, what if we built an entirely different system? One that the maritime monitoring architecture cannot touch because it never goes anywhere near the ocean. The answer had been embedded in history for more than 2,000 years, waiting to be rediscovered by people with sufficient strategic imagination and sufficient political will to act on it. Long before supertankers, long before steam-powered vessels of any kind, long before any form of maritime industrialization had been conceived. The arteries of global commerce ran overland. The Silk Road, that vast, loosely connected network of caravan routes connecting China to Persia to the Mediterranean world, carried the goods that built civilizations across 3 continents. Silk and porcelain flowing westward, gold and glassware moving eastward, ideas, agricultural techniques, religious traditions, and unfortunately diseases spreading in both directions across deserts, mountain passes, and high plateaus that no navy in the world could patrol or control. Commerce along those routes was slow. It was often dangerous. It was conducted in the shadow of empires rather than under their direct administration, which was, in many respects, precisely the point. No single power could dominate trade that moved through dozens of different political territories along a route spanning thousands of kilometers. The Industrial Revolution effectively buried those overland routes under the economics of maritime efficiency. A single supertanker can carry roughly 10,000 times more cargo than a camel caravan and complete a voyage across the Indian Ocean in weeks rather than the months required to traverse Central Asian mountain passes. The logic of oceanic scale crushed the economic case for overland commerce in everything except local and regional trade. But in 2013, China made a decision that would prove to be one of the most strategically significant of the 21st century. President Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, an infrastructure investment program of genuinely historic ambition and scope. Officially, it was framed as a development partnership designed to deliver mutual benefit to participating nations, with China committing to finance and construct railways, highways, energy pipelines, deepwater ports, telecommunications networks, and associated infrastructure across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and extending into Europe. The total investment, by various estimates, has already exceeded $1 trillion, and it continues to grow. The stated rationale emphasized economic development, enhanced connectivity, and shared prosperity. The unstated strategic logic was equally clear to anyone paying careful attention. China was constructing a network of trade infrastructure that it would control, running through nations bound to Beijing by debt obligations and infrastructure dependencies, operating entirely outside the maritime system that the United States had spent decades mastering and weaponizing. The Belt and Road Initiative provided the framework. The Iran-China Oil Railway became the most consequential single application of that framework. The engineering challenge involved in constructing this railway system was formidable in ways that deserve to be described clearly, because the scale of what was actually built tends to get lost in the political drama surrounding it. The route begins in Iran's northern oil-producing regions near the Caspian Sea, where a substantial portion of the country's crude output is concentrated. From there, oil travels northward, initially through pipeline, to specially constructed rail loading terminals built specifically for this purpose, representing a significant infrastructure investment in their own right. The first major transit nation is Turkmenistan, one of the most isolated and authoritarian states on Earth, governed by a succession of eccentric strongmen and largely cut off from meaningful Western diplomatic engagement. But Turkmenistan sits atop substantial natural gas reserves of its own and has both the railway infrastructure and the political incentive to participate. For Ashgabat, the calculation was entirely straightforward. China asks no uncomfortable questions about human rights conditions or democratic governance standards. China pays reliably and on time, and facilitating oil transit generates transit fees and attracts infrastructure investment that the government values. The decision to participate required very little deliberation. From Turkmenistan, the route enters Kazakhstan, a nation of an entirely different order of scale and complexity. Kazakhstan is Central Asia's largest economy, occupying a vast and resource-rich stretch of steppe between Russia to the north and China to the east. It has historically navigated the competing interests of major powers with considerable skill, maintaining productive relationships with Moscow, Beijing, Washington, and European capitals simultaneously. Its oil sector, developed substantially with Western investment during the post-Soviet period, has made it a meaningful player in global energy markets. Kazakhstan's existing rail infrastructure, built extensively during the Soviet era, required serious modernization to handle large-scale oil transit at the volumes envisioned. Chinese state enterprises invested heavily. New transshipment terminals were constructed at border crossings. Loading and unloading facilities were upgraded and expanded. Those border crossings, incidentally, introduce one of the most technically complex challenges in the entire system, one that, honestly, most people outside the railway industry have never encountered, but that matters enormously in practice. Iran's railways use standard gauge track, the same width between rails used across most of Europe and North America. The Soviet-era railways of both Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan use a broader gauge, a deliberate choice made during the Soviet period, partly for military reasons, making it physically impossible for foreign rolling stock to simply roll across the border and continue. China's own extensive rail network uses yet another specification. Every border crossing in this system requires transshipment, a laborious and time-consuming process of pumping oil from one set of specialized tank cars into another built to the specifications of the next country's track gauge. It adds time, it adds labor cost, it adds operational complexity. Then there is the climate challenge. Central Asia does not offer gentle or forgiving operating conditions. In Kazakhstan's northern regions, winter temperatures routinely drop to -40 degrees Celsius. In the Taklamakan Desert, through which the route passes in its final stretch across China's Xinjiang province, summer temperatures can reach 45 degrees or higher. The tank cars carrying crude oil must be engineered to perform reliably across that entire temperature range, without structural failure, without leaking, and without the oil inside either congealing in extreme cold or overheating in extreme summer temperatures. None of these challenges were ultimately insurmountable. They were simply expensive and time-consuming to solve. And the governments and state enterprises involved had both the capital and the strategic motivation to solve them. By late 2023, the pieces were in place. Loading terminals in northern Iran had been completed and operationally tested. Hundreds of specially manufactured thermally insulated tank cars had been built to specification. Transit agreements with both Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan had been formalized, described publicly by officials in both countries as purely commercial arrangements, which in a strictly legal sense they were, even if the political implications extended considerably deeper. And in January 2024, the first full-scale oil train completed the entire journey from Iranian oil fields to Chinese refineries. The transit took approximately 2 weeks, significantly longer than a supertanker voyage across the Indian Ocean. It cost considerably more per barrel than conventional maritime shipping. It required coordinated logistics across multiple sovereign nations, several different railway systems, and an infrastructure investment program that had taken years to design and execute. But it arrived, every barrel of it, intact, delivered. And not a single provision of the American sanctions architecture, that vast, sophisticated, expensively maintained system built around maritime oil trade, could do anything whatsoever about it. There is a particular kind of institutional shock that settles over a government when something it had categorized as strategically impossible turns out to have already happened, while the relevant agencies were focused on the system they knew rather than the one that was quietly taking shape.